John Calvin is one of the most significant figures in the 16th century. His French edition of the Institutes helped shape the French language. His writing on politics helped shape modern politics in certain important ways. He is a transitional figure, born in 1509. Luther was born in 1483, so there's some time between Luther's birth and Calvin's. The Reformation really begins to mature around 1519, 1521. So Calvin is a very young man. He's a young boy at that point. So the Reformation is in its early stages when he becomes a Protestant in the early 1530s. He was raised a Roman Catholic, a faithful Roman Catholic, went off to university, encountered Luther's ideas in university, and was really taken by them. He was supposed to be a theologian or studying theology in university. His father got in trouble with the church and then ordered his son, John, to begin study of the law. And so Calvin sort of reluctantly begins studying the law, but as he runs across Luther, he sort of abandons, in a sense, sets aside his law studies and goes back to reading theology. And by the early 1530s, he's already a leading voice among the evangelicals in Paris, was involved in some way, we don't know entirely, with an uprising in Paris, Protestant uprising, has to flees under an assumed name, ends up in the providence of God in Geneva. Already by this point he had published his Institutes, the first edition of his Institutes, which were well received, and Guillaume Farel gets a hold of him and says, basically, you have to stay and help us. Calvin says, I'm just a scholar, and Farel says, God will curse your work if you don't stay and help us. That's the famous, dreadful imprecation, and Calvin stays. The people of Geneva were not very as convinced as Farel that Calvin should stay and help, so that first attempt at reforming Geneva was not an entire success, and the city council essentially sent him packing. Calvin left happily, spent 3 years in Strasbourg with Butzer, and sort of got his, in a sense, graduate theological training as sort of an internship with Butzer as Calvin was pastoring a French-speaking congregation there. And towards the end of that 3 years, Geneva asked for him back and realized that they needed someone, and they needed him to help lead that Reformation and to teach the city. And so he came back and picked up his preaching ministry right where he had left off, was an unhappy, uncomfortable, in some ways, alien resident in Geneva for most of his time. Really only in the last few years was he comfortable, and in some ways never entirely, and only at the very end was he ever actually even a citizen. He met a lot of resistance through the years in Geneva. He had a lot of doubt about the number of people in Geneva who were actually regenerate, but he was a faithful minister, faithful preacher, did an enormous amount of work, produced a great body of literature, more than 50 volumes of Bible commentary. Of course, the Institutes of the Christian Religion, which he edited almost continuously from the 1530s until his death, producing both French and Latin editions of the Institutes. Also published numerous treatises, wrote volumes and volumes of correspondence, of which we only have just a few volumes in English, and essentially helped to set the pattern for Reformed theology, piety, and practice for the succeeding centuries.